The first call came while Amaka was rinsing rice at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, radio murmuring softly in the background. She let it ring, assuming it was another unknown number or a telemarketer, something easily ignored in a city where phones rang for everything and nothing. The second call came 10 minutes later, just as she was seasoning stew, and she frowned slightly, wiping her hands on a cloth before answering with polite impatience. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, almost apologetic, introducing herself as a school accountant and asking if this was Mrs. Adeyemi, David's mother. Amaka confirmed, already half distracted, expecting the usual reminder or routine confirmation. Instead, the woman hesitated, then said there seemed to be an issue with David's school fees. Amaka laughed lightly, certain it was a mistake, explaining that her husband had paid weeks ago, personally proud of doing it early that term. The accountant apologized again and promised to check. The call ended, but unease lingered like steam that refused to clear. By midday, the calls resumed, persistent, careful, too deliberate to be ignored. Each time, the explanation grew firmer, the tone less uncertain. There was a discrepancy, they said. The payment record existed, yes, but it had been reversed. Cancelled. Removed from the system. Amaka stood in the small living room with the phone pressed to her ear, staring at the family photo on the wall, Tun smiling confidently, arm draped over her shoulder, David standing proudly between them in his school uniform. Reversed how? She asked, her voice tightening despite herself. The accountant explained slowly, as if speaking to someone fragile, that the transaction had been deliberately wiped off from the original account. This was not an error. This was an action. Amaka thanked her, ended the call, and stood very still, listening to the refrigerator hum, the distant sound of traffic outside, the ordinary noises of a life that suddenly felt untrustworthy. The final call came in the evening, just as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the floor. This time, there was no apology in the voice on the other end. Only procedure. The school needed payment within 5 days, or David would not be allowed to continue. Amaka agreed politely, promising to resolve it, her voice calm even as her chest tightened painfully. When the call ended, she sank onto the couch, phone still in her hand, heart racing as questions collided in her mind. Tun had paid. She was certain. He had even joked about how organized he was becoming, how a responsible father deserved praise. She reached for her phone again, dialed his number, and listened as it rang unanswered. Once, twice, 3 times. Outside, the evening settled peacefully, unaware that something had begun to fracture inside that quiet living room, something that would never return to its original shape. Sleep did not come easily that night. Amaka lay awake listening to the rhythmic breathing of her son from the next room, each sound anchoring her while her thoughts spiraled relentlessly. By morning, she was already dressed when the school called again, her resolve firm but fragile. This time, she asked for details. Dates, times, proof. The accountant obliged, pulling up records, reading aloud numbers and confirmations that felt unreal as they settled into Amaka's ears. The payment had been made, yes. The payment had been reversed, yes. The reversal date was clear, undeniable. Amaka asked the woman to repeat it. When she did, Amaka felt something inside her go cold. 2 days ago. Exactly 2 days ago. The same day Tun had packed a small bag, kissed her cheek, kissed David's forehead, and said he was traveling briefly for work. The same day he promised to call. The same day he stopped answering. She thanked the accountant, ended the call, and sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the wall as memories rearranged themselves into something ugly and sharp. 2 days ago, Tun had been unusually gentle. He had smiled too much, spoken too softly, avoided her eyes while insisting the trip was important but short. He had not argued when she asked questions. He had not complained. He had simply left. At the time, she had been grateful for the peace. Now, the silence replayed itself as intention. Amaka opened her banking app with trembling fingers, her heart pounding as numbers loaded slowly, cruelly. The joint account balance stared back at her, drained. Savings gone. Rent money gone. She refreshed the page again, as if disbelief could summon a different result. It did not. She covered her mouth with her hand, not to scream, but to stop the sound that threatened to escape her chest. By afternoon, confirmation replaced doubt. Tun's office confirmed his resignation, effective weeks earlier. His phone remained unreachable. And then, as if the universe decided subtlety was no longer necessary, a message arrived from a neighbor, an image attached without explanation. Amaka opened it slowly. There was Tund, unmistakably him, standing under a bright sky, arm wrapped intimately around a woman Amaka recognized instantly. The Mistress. The woman he had dismissed, defended, and sworn meant nothing. They were smiling, relaxed, free. Amaka stared at the photo for a long time, not blinking, not breathing properly, as understanding settled like ash. The school fees had not just been reversed. They had been sacrificed, erased deliberately so a different life could be funded. And in that moment, Amaka understood that what had been taken from her was not just money, but trust, stability, and the illusion that responsibility still mattered to the man she married. The memory of Tun's departure replayed itself with cruel clarity, every detail sharpening now that the truth had emerged. Amaka remembered how he had packed lightly, too lightly for a man supposedly traveling for work, folding clothes with hurried efficiency, avoiding conversation. She remembered how he had stood in the doorway that morning, shoes already on, phone in hand, checking the time unnecessarily. He had hugged her quickly, a brief squeeze that lacked warmth, then turned to David with exaggerated cheer, ruffling his hair and promising souvenirs. At the time, Amaka had smiled, waving them both goodbye, unaware she was witnessing the end of something permanent. Now, the memory felt staged, rehearsed, like a performance designed to look normal enough not to raise suspicion. The house had changed almost immediately after he left. Not dramatically, not loudly, but subtly, the way absence announces itself before it is acknowledged. His side of the bed stayed undisturbed. His shoes remained by the door, lined neatly as if he planned to return. Amaka moved through the space carefully, touching nothing, as though disturbing these objects would confirm what she wasn't ready to say aloud. She cleaned mechanically, cooked automatically, her mind replaying conversations, arguments she thought were resolved, moments she had mistaken for growth. Every small memory rewrote itself, revealing what she had ignored in the comfort of familiarity. That evening, as David did his homework at the dining table, Amaka watched him quietly, noting the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the seriousness with which he approached even simple tasks. She wondered how much he had noticed. Children always noticed more than adults believed. The thought made her chest ache. She looked around the living room, the modest furniture, the framed family photo, the curtains she had chosen with care, and felt the weight of responsibility settle fully onto her shoulders. Tund had not just left the house. He had stepped away from duty. And as night fell, Amaka understood something deeply unsettling. This goodbye had never been temporary. It had been an exit, carefully planned, financially executed, and emotionally abandoned long before she ever realized she was standing alone. The photo did not arrive with a warning. There was no explanation, no caption, no apology attached to it, just an image sent quietly, as if it were an ordinary thing. Amaka stared at her phone for several seconds before opening it, already sensing that whatever waited on the screen would not be harmless. When the image loaded, her fingers went numb. Tund stood beside a woman under a bright, careless sky, his arm around her waist in a way that spoke of comfort, familiarity, and ownership. They were not posed stiffly like strangers caught by chance. They leaned into each other, relaxed, smiling without restraint. The woman's head rested lightly against his shoulder, her body angled toward him as if she belonged there. Amaka felt the room tilt slightly as she took in the details, the casual clothes, the ease in Tund's posture, the absence of any trace of worry. This was not a man on a short work trip. This was a man who had already arrived where he intended to be. She zoomed in slowly, as though distance might soften the blow. It did not. She recognized the woman instantly, the colleague he had mentioned too often, defended too carefully, brushed aside whenever Amaka's instincts stirred. The woman he once laughed about, insisting Amaka was imagining things. The betrayal settled deep, not as a sharp pain, but as a heavy pressure that made breathing difficult. Amaka lowered herself onto the couch, phone still glowing in her hand, the image burning into her vision. She did not cry. Her body seemed to be conserving energy, as though it understood this was not the moment for collapse. Instead, memories began to align: late nights, sudden secrecy, unexplained irritation when questioned. The signs she had explained away now arranged themselves into a clear, merciless truth. As evening darkened the room, Amaka sat unmoving, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan and the distant laughter of children playing outside, a sound that felt cruelly out of place. Her life had not shattered loudly. It had cracked quietly, cleanly, like glass breaking without a sound. She wondered briefly how long Tund had been living this other life, how long he had been planning his exit, while she worried about groceries and school schedules. The thought did not make her angry. It made her tired. The kind of tired that comes when effort has been wasted on someone who is already gone. When she finally set the phone down, Amaka understood something with painful clarity. The photo was not proof of betrayal. It was confirmation of abandonment that had already happened. Amaka called Tund again that night, not because she expected an answer, but because silence needed to be confronted directly. The phone rang until it stopped, then went to voicemail without ceremony. She left no message. What words could possibly reach someone who had already erased her from his plans? She tried again an hour later. Nothing. By morning, the silence had taken on weight, pressing down on her chest as she moved through her routine with mechanical precision. She prepared breakfast, packed David's lunch, and walked him to the bus stop as she always did, smiling when necessary, responding when spoken to, all while carrying a truth that felt far too heavy for an ordinary morning. After David left, the house fell quiet again. Amaka sat at the dining table with her phone in front of her, scrolling through old messages, searching for anything that resembled an explanation. There was none. No argument. No warning. No dramatic farewell. Just absence. She called his office again, asking questions she already knew the answers to, confirming details she hoped might somehow change. They were polite, distant, careful. Tun no longer worked there. He had resigned weeks earlier. He had planned this. The realization settled slowly, painfully. This was not impulse. This was preparation. He had untangled himself deliberately, step by step, leaving her to discover the damage only after it was complete. By afternoon, Amaka stopped calling. Not because she had found peace, but because she understood something essential. Lies could be challenged, argued with, dismantled. Silence could not. Silence meant decisions had already been made. She placed the phone face down on the table and sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, feeling the full weight of being intentionally left behind. Tund had not argued his way out of the marriage. He had not asked to be understood. He had simply removed himself, confident that whatever remained would sort itself out without him. In that silence, Amaka felt grief rise, not for the man he was, but for the stability she believed she had. And as the day ended, she realized the loudest statement Tund had ever made was saying nothing at all. That evening, Amaka waited until David finished his homework before speaking. She watched him carefully as he wrote, noting the seriousness with which he approached his work, the way his tongue pressed lightly against his lip in concentration. When he finally looked up, sensing her gaze, she motioned for him to come sit beside her on the bed. The room was quiet, lit softly by a single lamp. Amaka took a breath, choosing her words with care, knowing that whatever she said would shape how her son understood not just his father, but the world. "David," she began gently, "your daddy made a mistake." The word felt inadequate, but it was all she had. David nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, waiting for more. She explained as simply as she could, avoiding details that would burden him unnecessarily. She told him his father had gone away for reasons she did not fully understand, and that it might take some time before things made sense again. David listened without interruption, his hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes fixed on the floor. When she finished, he did not cry. He did not ask questions. He sat quietly, absorbing the information with a stillness that unsettled her more than tears would have. Amaka reached for his hand instinctively, squeezing it gently, as though physical contact might anchor them both. After a moment, David looked up at her. "Is it because of me?" he asked softly. The question struck her like a blow. Amaka pulled him into her arms immediately, holding him tightly, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "No," she said without hesitation. "Never because of you." David nodded, accepting her answer, but something in his eyes shifted, an awareness, a seriousness that did not belong to a child. As he stood to return to his room, Amaka watched him go, feeling the weight of what she could not protect him from. That night, as she lay awake listening to his breathing through the thin wall, Amaka understood that while she could explain absence, she could not erase its impact. And something inside her son had already begun to change. The letter arrived folded neatly inside David's school folder, its edges crisp, its tone polite enough to disguise the threat beneath it. Amaka unfolded it slowly at the kitchen table, reading each line with care, though she already knew what it would say. The school acknowledged the earlier confusion, expressed appreciation for her cooperation, and then delivered its conclusion without hesitation. The outstanding fees were to be paid within 5 working days, or David's enrollment would be suspended. Amaka placed the paper down carefully, smoothing it flat as though treating it gently might soften its meaning. 5 days. Not 5 weeks. Not when possible. 5 days to produce money that no longer existed. She looked around the room, the modest furniture, the half-finished renovations, the life she had carefully maintained, and felt the walls close in slightly. She considered calling Tund again, just once, not to plead, but to remind him of responsibility. The thought passed quickly. Pride was not the reason she didn't call. Clarity was. She knew now that responsibility was exactly what he had abandoned, and no reminder would restore it. Instead, she began calculating quietly, pulling out a notebook, writing figures in neat columns. Rent, food, transport, fees. Each number stared back at her, indifferent to her worry. By the time David returned from school that afternoon, Amaka had already made a decision she would never speak aloud, that she would carry this burden alone, whatever the cost. There would be no begging, no dramatic appeals. Her son would not watch her shrink herself for a man who had already chosen to disappear. That night, as Amaka prepared dinner, David hovered nearby more than usual, watching her movements with quiet attention. She noticed the way his eyes followed her, the way he hesitated before speaking, as though measuring the right moment. When she finally sat down, he asked gently, "Mummy, are we okay?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid. Amaka smiled, nodding. "We will be," she replied, her voice steady. And, as she said it, she understood that 5 days was not just a deadline. It was a test of endurance, of dignity, and of how much strength silence could hold. The next evening, David waited until Amaka had finished washing the dishes before speaking. He followed her into the living room, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, and stood there quietly until she noticed him. When she looked up, he placed the bag gently on the couch and unzipped the front pocket with deliberate care. "Mummy," he said softly, "I have something." Amaka watched confused as he reached inside and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper. He placed it in her hand without ceremony, his expression serious. When she unfolded it, her breath caught. Crumpled notes spilled into her palm, small denominations, carefully saved. Not much, but enough to tell a story. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David shrugged slightly. "I draw for some kids at school," he explained. "They like superheroes. Sometimes they pay me." Amaka stared at him, the room blurring as understanding hit her. This money was not accidental. It was intentional, saved quietly, patiently, without complaint. "I wanted to buy a science kit," David added after a pause. "But you can use it." The words struck her harder than any accusation could have. Amaka felt tears rise suddenly, hot and uncontrollable, and she pulled him into her arms before he could say anything else, holding him tightly as her body shook. When she finally pulled back, she shook her head firmly, wiping her eyes. "David, this is not your job," she said, forcing strength into her voice. "I am the mother." David nodded, accepting her words, but his gaze did not waver. There was no defiance in it, only resolve. In that moment, Amaka realized something had shifted between them. Her son was no longer just a child sheltered from hardship. He had stepped, quietly and willingly, into awareness. As she held the small bundle of money in her hand, Amaka understood that while the amount could not solve their problem, the gesture had changed everything. It reminded her that she was not carrying this alone. Later that night, after David had returned to his room, Amaka sat alone on the couch, the weight of the day pressing down on her chest. The money lay on the table in front of her, a small, painful symbol of love and responsibility arriving from the wrong direction. She was still staring at it when David appeared again, standing quietly at the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "Mummy," he said gently, "can I say something?" She nodded, gesturing for him to sit beside her. He did so slowly, folding his hands together the way he always did when he was nervous. "Daddy didn't leave because of us," David said after a moment. Amaka's heart tightened. "He left because he forgot who he was." The words landed softly, but their impact was immense. Amaka turned to look at her son, searching his face, but he was not seeking approval. He was stating a truth he had already accepted. "People who remember who they are don't run away from their children," he continued quietly, "even when things are hard." Amaka felt tears spill freely now, no longer trying to stop them. This was not something she had taught him. This was something he had understood on his own. She pulled him into her arms again, holding him tightly, her tears soaking into his shoulder. In that moment, something inside Amaka settled, not peace, but purpose. Her son had named the truth, and in doing so, he had given shape to her pain. Tund had not just abandoned them financially. He had abandoned his identity. As David stood to return to his room, Amaka watched him go with a mixture of pride and sorrow, understanding that childhood had ended quietly that day. And as she lay awake later, listening to the steady rhythm of her son's breathing, Amaka made a silent promise. Whatever came next, she would make sure David never forgot who he was. Amaka woke before dawn, not because she was rested, but because anxiety refused to let her sleep. The school deadline sat in her mind like a stone, heavy and unmoving. She stood in the bathroom mirror, tying her headscarf slowly, studying her own face as though it belonged to someone else. There was no makeup to hide exhaustion, no dramatic expression of heartbreak, just the quiet look of a woman forced to carry more than she was meant to carry. She dressed carefully, not in her best clothes, but in her most respectable ones. Simple, clean, pressed. She was not going to the school as a beggar. She was going as a mother, a woman, a human being with a story she did not choose, but would not be crushed by. Before leaving, she packed David's lunch, kissed his forehead, and watched him walk out with his backpack, his posture calm, as if he believed her promise that they would be okay. She held onto that belief the way drowning people hold onto air. At the school gate, she moved past the usual bustle of parents dropping off children, her steps steady even though her stomach felt hollow. In the reception area, she asked to see the principal, her voice composed, her tone firm but polite. She sat in the waiting chair with her hands folded neatly in her lap, listening to the distant sound of lessons beginning, chalk against board, children reciting in unison. The normalcy of it almost broke her. When she was finally called in, she stood, smoothed her blouse, and walked into the principal's office with a kind of controlled dignity that comes from having no other choice. The principal greeted her with professional warmth and offered a seat. Amaka sat, took a breath, and spoke plainly. She did not dramatize. She did not insult Tund. She did not cry for sympathy. She explained the reversal, the disappearance, the sudden financial collapse, only the facts, presented with steady honesty. The principal listened without interrupting, her face unreadable at first, then gradually softening in a way Amaka did not expect. When Amaka finished, there was silence, not the cold kind that Tund had used, but the thoughtful kind that comes before mercy. Amaka held the silence, without rushing to fill it. She refused to shrink. She refused to plead. If they insisted on the deadline, she would accept it and find another way, even if it meant starting over in a new school. But she would not collapse in front of strangers and call it humility. Finally, the principal spoke. She asked a few questions, practical ones, careful ones. Amaka answered. Then she added quietly, almost as if to herself, "Your son is a good boy." Amaka nodded, swallowing hard. "He is," she agreed. And for the first time in days, she felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not relief, not joy, but the faint possibility that dignity could still open doors even when life tried to close them. The principal did not make a speech. She did not offer pity dressed as kindness. Instead, she reached into a drawer, pulled out a folder, and began speaking in a tone that was firm, measured, and quietly protective. She explained the school's policy, then explained how policy could still leave room for humanity. There could be an extension, she said. Not endless, not careless, but enough time for Amaka to find her footing. Amaka sat very still as the word sank in. She had come prepared to fight for her son's place, not with aggression, but with endurance. She had not come expecting space to breathe. "We will give you time," the principal said finally. "And we will not embarrass David." The last sentence hit Amaka harder than the first, because that had been her greatest fear, not just losing the school, but losing David's dignity in the process. As Amaka stepped out of the principal's office, she felt her shoulders drop slightly, as if they had been raised for days without her noticing. The receptionist offered her water. A teacher passing by smiled at her gently, not the nosy smile of gossip, but the knowing smile of someone who had seen hardship before. "David is doing well," the teacher said quietly. "He's very focused." Amaka thanked her, voice tight, and turned away quickly before emotion could undo her composure. Outside the office block, she paused under a tree, letting the morning air touch her face. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't victory. It was grace, unexpected, undeserved, and deeply needed. By the time she returned home, the world had not changed, but Amaka had. She began making calls, not to Tund, not to relatives who would ask too many questions, but to people who could offer practical help. A woman from church recommended a small catering job. A neighbor mentioned a part-time shop assistant position. A parent from a school, one she barely knew, sent a message later that afternoon. "Madam, I heard David is a brilliant boy. If you need extra lesson support for him, I can help." The message made Amaka sit down abruptly, hand covering her mouth. People were noticing, not gossiping with cruelty, but noticing with compassion. And as these small threads of support began to appear, Amaka understood the quiet truth of survival. Sometimes the people who save you are not the ones who promised forever. Sometimes they are strangers who simply refuse to let you drown. The following weeks did not become easier overnight. Grace was not money. Extension was not stability. Amaka still had bills, still had rent, still had the daily pressure of feeding a growing child in a city that did not pause for heartbreak. But she moved differently now, more deliberate, more alert, more aware of every naira and every hour. She began waking earlier, taking small jobs that filled the gaps, helping a neighbor sell pastries, assisting at a small event on weekends, tutoring a younger child in the evenings. Her hands were always busy, but her mind was busier, learning how to stretch resources without letting life stretch her dignity thin. She kept her struggles private, not because she was ashamed, but because she understood that not everyone who asked questions deserved answers. She learned to smile without explaining, to nod without agreeing, to carry herself like someone who was rebuilding rather than falling apart. David adapted quietly, and that was both comforting and heartbreaking. He stopped asking when his father would return. He stopped checking the door when a car slowed outside. He became more responsible without being told, washing his plates, folding his uniform, arranging his books neatly as if order could protect him from chaos. At school, he remained focused, his grades steady, his teachers impressed by his calm discipline. At home, he sometimes sat in silence longer than a child should, staring at his notebooks, as though thinking beyond his age. Amaka watched him carefully, feeling pride and sorrow tangled together. She wanted him to be carefree. Instead, life had given him awareness. And yet, even in that awareness, David did not become bitter. He became steady. He became thoughtful. He became the kind of child who would grow into a man who understood consequences. One evening, as they ate dinner in the living room, Amaka caught David watching her. "Mummy," he said softly, "you don't cry like before." Amaka paused, spoon hovering midair. She didn't know whether to laugh or break. "I cry inside sometimes," she admitted, her voice gentle. David nodded, as if that was enough. Then he said, "But you're still here." The words were simple, yet they held the entire meaning of their new life. Amaka reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Yes," she said firmly. "I am still here." And in that moment, she understood that this was the foundation of everything that would come next. Not revenge, not punishment, not drama. Just endurance. Just presence. Just the quiet rebuilding of a life that no one would ever be able to wipe off like a reverse transaction again. Far from the quiet discipline of the life he abandoned, Tun's new world was built on illusion. At first, everything felt effortless. The laughter came easily. The days stretched lazily into one another, filled with indulgence and the false confidence of a man who believed he had escaped consequences. The woman beside him admired him loudly, praised his bravery, called him bold for choosing happiness. Tun drank deeply from the validation, mistaking desire for respect and comfort for success. He told himself he had earned this freedom, that responsibility had weighed him down unfairly, that starting over meant leaving everything behind without looking back. For a while the lie worked. He stopped thinking about school fees, rent, routines. He stopped thinking about the small, persistent needs of a child. He allowed pleasure to convince him that silence was peace. But fantasy is expensive, and reality always sends a bill. The money began to thin faster than he expected. Comfort required maintenance. Admiration came with expectations. The woman's tone changed subtly at first, questions replacing compliments, impatience creeping into conversations that once felt light. She noticed when his calls went unanswered, when his confidence faltered, when promises of soon stretched too long. The warmth that had drawn him in cooled quickly, replaced by a sharper, more demanding presence. Tun found himself irritated by the very freedom he had chased. There were no routines to anchor him, no structure to lean against. Just days that demanded constant effort to remain enjoyable. And enjoyment, he discovered, was exhausting without purpose. The end came quietly, without confrontation or drama. One morning, the woman packed her things with efficient indifference, explaining calmly that this was not what she signed up for. She wanted stability, not stories. Security, not excuses. Tund watched her leave, stunned not by the loss of her affection, but by the speed with which it disappeared. There was no loyalty in a life built on abandonment. When the door closed behind her, the silence that followed was heavier than the one he had left behind at home. This time, there was no family photo on the wall. No child's laughter in the next room. Just the unmistakable realization that he had traded permanence for pleasure, and lost both. When Tund finally returned, it was not with confidence or demands, but with caution. He stood outside the familiar building longer than necessary, studying the door as though it might reject him. Time had thinned him. His clothes hung looser. His posture lacked the ease it once carried. The arrogance that had once filled his movements had been replaced by uncertainty, by the careful steps of a man unsure of his place. When he knocked, it was soft, hesitant. Amaka opened the door and regarded him quietly, taking in the changes without comment. There was no anger on her face, no surprise, just recognition without welcome. "I made a mistake," Tun began, his voice subdued. The words sounded rehearsed, stripped of detail. He spoke of confusion, of pressure, of things not going as planned. He avoided specifics, careful not to name betrayal outright. Amaka listened without interruption, arms folded loosely, her expression composed. When he finished, she did not respond immediately. Silence filled the space between them, not the helpless silence he had used, but a deliberate one. "David is inside," she said eventually. "If you want to see him, you may." She stepped aside, not as an invitation, but as a boundary. Tund entered cautiously, as though afraid the walls themselves might judge him. David looked up from his book when he heard the movement. His eyes met his father's, and for a moment, nothing happened. There was no rush forward, no visible anger, just a pause long enough to confirm something irreversible had shifted. Tund smiled weakly, reaching out instinctively, then stopping himself. "My boy," he said softly. David stood slowly, placing the book aside, his expression calm but distant. He did not hug his father. He did not step back either. He simply stood there, grounded, watching. Amaka observed from a distance, understanding, instinctively, that whatever happened next would not belong to her. This was no longer a conversation between adults. This was a reckoning between presence and absence. David was the first to speak. His voice was steady, unshaken by emotion. "You can sit," he said politely, gesturing toward the chair. Tund obeyed, surprised by the formality. The boy remained standing, his posture straight, his hands at his sides. He did not speak like a child rehearsing adult words. He spoke like someone who had spent months thinking quietly. "Mummy told me you made a mistake," David continued. "But mistakes are things people try to fix." The words landed gently, but firmly. Tund swallowed, nodding slowly. "I came back to fix things," he said quickly, grasping at the opening. David shook his head, slightly. "Coming back is not the same as staying," he replied. The room felt suddenly smaller. "When you left, things became hard. Not just money hard, quiet hard." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Mummy stayed. She worked. She didn't complain in front of me. She didn't leave." Tund lowered his gaze, shame settling into his shoulders. Amaka felt tears rise, but she remained still, allowing her son to finish. This was his moment, earned through silence and endurance. "I don't hate you," David said finally. "But I know who I can depend on now." He took a small step forward, not toward his father, but toward clarity. "You can see me," he added calmly. "But you can't stay." The words did not carry anger. They carried finality. Tund opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. There was nothing left to argue. The authority he assumed biology gave him had dissolved in the face of consistency and presence. As he stood to leave, his movements slow and defeated, David watched quietly. Amaka watched too. And in that moment, the power in the room was unmistakable. The child who was abandoned had grown into someone no longer waiting to be chosen. After Tund left the flat that day, the silence he left behind was different from before. It was not the hollow quiet of uncertainty, nor the tense quiet of waiting. It was settled. Amaka felt it immediately as she closed the door and leaned her back against it, eyes closed, breathing deeply as though she had just crossed a difficult threshold. David returned to his book without being told, sitting in his usual spot by the window, posture relaxed but resolute. There was no shaking in his hands, no visible sign that he had just drawn a boundary many adults never learn to draw. Amaka watched him from across the room, struck by the strange mixture of pride and grief that now lived permanently inside her. She had protected him from many things, but not this. This strength had grown in him quietly, shaped by absence and responsibility, and now it stood fully formed. That evening, Amaka and David ate dinner without speaking much. Not because there was tension, but because words felt unnecessary. The house seemed to recognize the shift, settling into itself more comfortably, as though a weight had been removed. Later, as Amaka washed dishes, she replayed David's words in her mind, not with disbelief, but with understanding. "You can see me, but you can't stay." It was not rejection. It was structure. It was the difference between access and entitlement. Tund could exist in David's life, now only on David's terms. And that, Amaka realized, was not cruelty. It was survival. That night, Amaka lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, thinking about how many times she had wished Tund would change, apologize, return fully. Now that the moment had passed, she felt no urge to chase it. Closure had arrived without negotiation. There would be no dramatic reconciliation to replay in memory. Just a clear line drawn quietly, firmly, and without bitterness. In the darkness, Amaka whispered a thank you, not to fate, not to Tund, but to the version of herself that had chosen dignity when chaos tried to demand desperation. Whatever came next, she knew this much. The foundation of their lives no longer depended on someone who could walk away. Tund felt the consequences of that day long before he understood them. They did not arrive as punishment or confrontation, but as absence layered upon absence. He tried calling David a few days later, leaving a message that sounded careful and restrained, as though politeness might substitute for presence. There was no response. He sent a message instead, then another, spacing them out to avoid appearing desperate. Still nothing. Weeks passed, then months, each one confirming what he had already sensed in that quiet living room. He had lost access to his son's inner life. He could observe from a distance, but he could not enter. The door had not been slammed. It had simply been closed. Socially, things did not improve. Friends listened politely to his explanations, nodding without engagement. When he spoke of rebuilding, of making amends, people changed the subject. There were no accusations, no confrontations, just a subtle withdrawal that mirrored the one he had practiced so well himself. He found that people remembered stories even when they pretended not to. Teachers did not call him. School events passed without his knowledge. He learned of David's achievements secondhand, through overheard conversations and untagged posts that made no space for him. The realization gnawed at him slowly. He had become optional, replaceable, peripheral to a life he once assumed would always orbit him. At night, Tund replayed moments he had dismissed as insignificant, the rushed goodbye, the reversed payment, the deliberate silence. He had believed distance would protect him from consequence. Instead, it had given consequence time to mature. Shame settled into his routines, quiet but persistent, surfacing when he least expected it. In conversations where fatherhood came up, he laughed awkwardly and changed the subject. In moments of loneliness, he reached for his phone, then put it down again. He understood now that apology without consistency was meaningless. And consistency was the one thing he had never learned to offer. The worst part was not being hated. It was being unnecessary. Years passed, not dramatically, but decisively. David grew into himself with a steadiness that drew people toward him. His achievements were not flashy, but they were consistent, built on discipline rather than ambition alone. He earned recognition slowly, the kind that comes when effort is sustained over time. Amaka watched him from the quiet pride of someone who had seen every difficult step, every night of exhaustion, every choice made without applause. When the invitation arrived for the public academic honor, she read it twice before handing it to David, her hands trembling slightly. He smiled, modest and calm, as though success was simply the result of doing what needed to be done. Tund heard about the event through distant channels and decided to attend, convincing himself that presence still counted for something. The hall was filled with voices, light, and anticipation. Amaka sat in the front row, composed and elegant, her posture reflecting years of resilience rather than struggle. Tund sat farther back, adjusting his jacket, scanning the room for familiar faces that no longer acknowledged him. When David's name was called, the applause was warm and sustained. He walked to the stage with measured confidence, greeting the host respectfully. After the citations were read and the audience settled, the host smiled and asked the question meant to inspire others. Who inspired you the most? The room quieted instantly. Tund leaned forward slightly, breath held, convinced that this was the moment that would soften the past. David stepped closer to the microphone. He did not search the audience. He did not hesitate. My mother, he said clearly. She stayed. He paused briefly, then added, when things became hard, she didn't leave. She showed me that responsibility isn't about comfort, it's about commitment. The applause that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Amaka bowed her head, overwhelmed by emotion she had never demanded but fully deserved. Tun did not clap. No one looked at him. In that moment, he understood the full cost of abandonment. He had not just lost time. He had lost legacy. He stood up quietly and walked out before the ceremony ended, disappearing without notice. Behind him, David continued forward, unburdened, unbroken, and free. Tun did not die in a way that made headlines or gathered crowds. There was no dramatic scene, no last-minute reconciliation, no grand confession that changed how people remembered him. His death came the way his consequences had come, quietly, steadily, almost like the final page of a book no one had been reading for a long time. One day, he was there, living in the thin space between regret and routine. And then one day he wasn't. The news traveled through family lines the way bad news often does, cautiously, with softened words, as if careful phrasing could soften reality itself. It reached people who once called him brother, cousin, friend. Some sighed, some shook their heads, some offered the polite expressions that death requires. But beneath the surface of those reactions sat another truth. Long before death arrived, Tund had already disappeared from the places that mattered. Amaka heard the news on an ordinary morning that carried no warning. The call came from a relative whose voice sounded rehearsed. Formal condolences delivered the way people deliver messages they don't want to be responsible for. Amaka listened quietly, thanked the caller, and ended the conversation without sinking into a chair or dropping her phone. There were no fresh tears waiting for Tund because her grieving had happened years earlier, in stages, first for the man she loved, then for the marriage she believed in, then for the stability she thought was guaranteed. What remained in her chest was not anger, not joy, but a strange calm, the kind that comes when life has already forced you to accept what you did not choose. She continued with her morning, stirring tea, checking the stove, wiping the counter, her movement steady, her face composed. It was not coldness. It was closure that had already been finalized long ago. When she told David later, she did not dramatize it. She simply said, "Your father is gone." David paused for a moment, standing still in a way that made time feel slower. His eyes lowered briefly, not in fear, not in shock, but in thought, as if he was acknowledging a fact rather than reacting to a loss. "Oh," he said softly. "Nothing more. No collapse. No questions. No sudden tears that would make people comfortable by proving the relationship still existed." David's response was not cruelty. It was the honest outcome of years of distance. You cannot mourn deeply what you have already been forced to bury emotionally while it was still alive. And in that quiet, the final consequence revealed itself clearly. Tun's punishment was not death. It was dying without a living legacy in the heart of his son. The burial was arranged quickly, as burials often are, with relatives moving in a familiar rhythm, phone calls, meetings, contributions, announcements. People gathered wearing black and solemn expressions, some carrying genuine sadness, others carrying the polite heaviness tradition demanded. Old stories began to surface, rounded at the edges to make them easier to swallow. People spoke of Tund as a man who tried, a man who made mistakes, a man who had his struggles, because death has a way of demanding gentler language even when truth was sharper. In quiet corners, some people whispered the real story, how he left, how he reversed his child's fees, how he returned too late, how his life shrank until it became mostly regret. But publicly, the narrative was softened, as if smoothing the truth could protect the family from embarrassment. As the day approached, the question everyone avoided began to hover over the preparations. It was not asked at first, but it lived in pauses, in glances, in the way people stopped mid-sentence. Finally, someone said it aloud at a family gathering. "Is his son coming?" The room went quiet. A few people looked away immediately, pretending not to have heard. Others stared at the floor as if answers could be found there. One aunt cleared her throat and said carefully, "He will not be coming." There was no explanation added, because the truth was too heavy to carry publicly. Some people reacted with shock, as though absence at a burial was the greatest disrespect. Others nodded slowly, understanding that respect is not only shown by showing up, sometimes it is shown by refusing to pretend. On the day of the burial, Amaka did not dress David in black. She did not drag him there to perform grief for people who had not carried his pain. David stayed home. He spent the day quietly, reading, studying, helping his mother with small chores, living the life they had built without spectacle. It was not that he celebrated his father's death. He did not. He simply refused to honor an image that did not match his reality. In another place, beneath the open sky, earth met earth, and people said final words over a man whose choices had already sealed his ending. No son stepped forward to speak his name. No child's voice softened the grave with forgiveness. And that was the most brutal, devastating revenge of all. Tund left this world the same way he lived after abandonment, present in body, absent in legacy. Meanwhile, in a modest home filled with quiet strength, the people he left behind continued forward, whole, unburdened, and finally free. Please like and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for the next amazing tale yet.